2 weeks ago, Infinity Train aired its last book as of now, Duet. I say as of now because even though the show has been cancelled, not all hope is lost. Owen Dennis, the creator, wrote a book 5, and if the fans push hard enough, HBO Max may greenlight book 5 and beyond. So if you're watching this on the day it came out, there's a trend party on Twitter with the phrase, "Finish Infinity Train." So if you like the show, tweet out that phrase and let's get it trending. Anyway, in this video, I'll review each episode, give them a score, and then talk about the season in general at the end. Also, spoilers for the entire show. Without any further ado, every episode of Infinity Train, Book 4, reviewed. Episode 1, The Twin Tapes. Once great friends, Ryan and Mingy's relationship slowly dissolves over the course of years of disgruntlement, culminating with their reunion in the restaurant. For the first time in the series, the vast majority of this episode takes place off the train, which means that we get a pretty good look at our main characters' lives before the train. This episode uses one, who we'll get to later, as a frame device as he narrates over their lives as he shows someone, who we'll also get to later, their tape. From the beginning, we get to see how closely that our main characters, Ryan and Mingy, are twined together. The first few scenes show the differences between the characters, as Ryan is completely committed to the band and laid back, while Mingy is pressured by his parents to focus on school and is more worried about the future. Anyway, this comes to a head beautifully at the Battle of the Bands, where Ryan reveals that he's already planned for them to take a trip. After Min bails out of fear, we get one of the best scenes of the entire show. We get a 3-minute montage of the next few months of their lives as a split screen, with Min on the left and Ryan on the right. This scene is fantastic on so many levels. The illusion that Ryan is having fun while Mingy suffers is quickly broken, as they expertly show that both characters are having a rough time. However, during this period apart, they are still clearly in sync, as shown with many of the parallel moments between them. Ryan's life falls apart as Mingy sets up the next chapter of his. This whole scene is loaded with color symmetry and other cinematic parallels, and sets up their arc incredibly well. We also get some stuff about where and when this book takes place, although the fact that it takes place in Canada should be obvious by the fact that Mingy says sorry 4 times in the first 11 minutes. Anyway, somehow the end of the scene tops the rest, as Ryan dramatically crosses into Mingy's life again. Anyway, Ryan once again tries to convince Mingy to do music, and when rejected, he steals Min's keys and runs. While in this episode it's not a big deal, luckily Ryan does get called out for this later. Anyway, both characters get onto a train, and then somewhat comedically onto a further train. The tape cuts there, and we get the reveal that One, who was only 1 at this point, was showing the tape to Amelia, who seemingly just made it to the engine. It's hard to say anything else about this scene besides that it's super cool. It's obvious that Amelia isn't completely satisfied with how 1 is running things, and shows how close she is to taking over. 1 is completely emotionless here, by nonchalantly saying that the teens may die. This sets up a dark background plot for the season. This whole opening episode does a great job setting up the book. The split scene is fantastic, we get a good intro to our characters, along with some great jokes and clues towards Amelia's past. Episode 2, The Iceberg Car. Waking up on the train together, Ryan and Mingy are met by Kez, whose mistake has left the boys in a predicament. This episode starts with the introduction to this book's denizen companion, Kez. While I'll talk about her character more later, especially as her arc becomes more apparent, in this episode she has a good joke or two, but it's mostly just annoying as she jokes about being clueless about stuff from the normal world. She isn't overbearing or anything, but her nonchalant attitude towards almost getting them killed makes it hard to justify why Mingy and Ryan agree to go with her. We get a look at the new denizens, which are much more cartoony than the previous ones from the series. This episode then slows down pretty dramatically, as we spend the next 4 minutes spent on a chase scene through time, which is somehow not nearly as cool as it sounds. Most of the arguing is pretty pointless, and the action is quite minimal. The joke with Kez asking the one true thought about gum is definitely the comedic highlight of the episode. Eventually, they figure out the puzzle, which was to turn the thermostat to the middle. Why 2 college-age people didn't figure this out is beyond me, but the last 3 minutes are much better than the 8 that preceded them. The shot with Ryan and Min looking into the wasteland is fantastic, and Kez's dialogue is not nearly as annoying as it was from the beginning of the episode. Also, the justification of their fighting is written well too. Overall, a slightly below episode. While the very end is pretty good, the beginning and especially the middle ranges from boring to frustrating, and Kez's first episode is pure annoyance. Episode 3, The Old West Car. Arriving in a Wild West town, Ryan, Mingy, and Kez attempt to escape the locals. Picking up right where the last episode left off, this episode kind of cements the fact that this season is going to be lighter in tone than the last, something I'll talk about more at the end of the video. While the chase scene to start off this episode was nothing more than a bit funny, things start to pick up once we meet Samantha once again. I think they use her well this season, as she was relegated to her smallest role in a book yet. While her appearance in previous seasons were good, and her appearance in book 3 especially being so fantastic, I'm glad they didn't try to shoehorn her into being more into the plot of this book. Anyway, the scene with Ryan flirting with a cat and the scene immediately after are some of the funniest things to come out of this show.
Why did you flirt with the cat? I don't know, man. She was kind of hot.
Honestly, the first half of this episode is really funny, which is kind of nice after Book 3's tragedy. Unfortunately, this episode doesn't have much else going for it. The trial scene is way too long for the joke, and while it does look fantastic, the ending scene is a bit too much of a stretch for me. Kez is clearly a jerk either way, as she either withheld information and made them think they're going to die, or she actually just abandoned them. Either way, they completely forgive her and move on, and saying that nobody understands Kez or something. We also get the first idea of the eventual climax of everyone chasing Kez, but I'll talk about that more when the time comes. Still, this episode is frustrating at times, and the comedy can only help it so much. Not unwatchable, but definitely a bit disappointing. Episode 4, The Pig Baby Car. Ryan and Minky are forced to satisfy Pig Baby with a perfect dessert. Again, until the very end of this episode, it's almost entirely focused on comedy. None of that in itself is terrible, as a giant pig baby voiced by J.K. Simmons is quite funny. Unfortunately for the episode, a couple of major things hold it back. To start off, Kez once again is public enemy number 1 in this car. But while I am glad to see a little bit of anger directed towards Kez about this, it does kind of contradict the little speech at the end of the last episode. Anyway, the cow creamer is on screen just enough to get a bit annoying by the end, but overall, she's a pretty funny joke for the episode. What doesn't add any value to this episode is them repeating Ryan rushing through and messing stuff up. They do this multiple times, more times than it would take any reasonable adult to realize that rushing stuff isn't gonna work. Eventually, Ryan gets the message that he's the one messing stuff up, and then is for some reason upset at Mingy. Anyway, fortunately for everyone, once they start making brownies, the episode becomes much better. We get a moment of quick reprieve from them fighting before some honestly great writing. Mingy becomes convinced that Ryan is the one linked to the number, and therefore becomes a jerk to him. This would fall completely on its face if it hadn't been Ryan who made them get onto the train. Ryan finally faces the consequences of doing that, as Mingy is able to easily assert that Ryan is the one who needs to change. Anyway, not much to say about the ending, besides that they cut out what probably would have been the best action of the episode. This episode once again has some great moments and jokes, and especially the last 2 minutes are written pretty well, but some parts drag on, and Kez's plotline is just not that interesting. Episode 5, The Astro Q Car. With a growing rift forming between them, Ryan and Mingy attempt to convince a bouncer to let them enter the rave. Unlike most other episodes, this first scene sets up the episode's tone instead of the setting, as it's clear that tensions are still high from the end of the last one. Immediately once getting into the car, Ryan and Kez getting hyped up for the party is really funny, especially compared to Min freaking out. While Ryan deciding to dig a hole was a bit ridiculous, and the fact that he dug it a couple feet away from the wall even more so, the way they decided to write both characters getting more and more upset is fantastic. This is also the first episode that Kez was actually a great addition to, partially because it's not really about her, and she also gets to shine more as comedic relief. Anyway, Ryan's ideas continue to get worse until he eventually, literally, runs off a cliff. While him launching himself past the portal was a bit ridiculous, it's hard not to appreciate Min's blow up after saving him. They pause for a second, and Ryan says thanks, and you think that the show will just write that they're cool now. Instead, Mingy snaps at Ryan for being reckless. While him being wrong about waiting should have been obvious, as they hadn't seen anyone getting in, and the only person they did see got crushed, this part is still really good.
You can mess up even if you stand still.
How they managed to tie in the car's gimmick of waiting forever to get into a party to Min-Gi's entire arc is honestly incredible, and it makes the questionable decisions about the setting completely justified. I also couldn't help but enjoy them turning into Daft Punk and Kaz moving corpses to cheer them on. The use of the hardening goo from before was also pretty clever. Finally, while not nearly as good as the last reveal to come in episode 5, this one does set a good amount of suspense for the next episode. I really struggle about what score to give this episode. On one hand, there were multiple scenes that were a bit disappointing, like Min not helping Ryan when the goo came up. On the other hand, the scene where Ryan gets saved is some of the best writing in the entire show. In the end, while I can't give it a perfect score due to some questionable scenes, this episode is great due to the dialogue between Min and Ryan, Kaz finally being a good character, and the suspenseful ending. Episode 6, The Party Car. With their instruments back, Ryan and Min-Gi have to play their first show since they were kids, but it's no easy emotional feat. After 4 episodes of nothing, we finally get more about what's going on with Amelia and 1. Obviously, I would have liked to see more of Amelia in this book besides her 3 appearances, but book 5 was supposed to be about Amelia, so I'll give it a pass. Giving Min-Gi and Ryan their stuff back was definitely a good choice, and as Amelia says, Unfortunately, in this episode, they decided to give Kez a subplot again. Fortunately, they barely spent any time on it. Still, I feel like I was just waiting to get back to Min and Ryan every time they showed her and her friends. Speaking of Min and Ryan, this episode is at its best when there's just them talking, which luckily is a significant chunk of the latter half of the episode. While them being friendly towards each other was nice for a bit, Min backing out of the concert once checking his keys is fantastic writing. And even after that, Ryan reassuring Min that they can work things out while sitting in a bathtub during an astronaut party somehow has some of the best writing of the series. They managed to write two 18-year-olds pretty well. Min finally starts to open up to Ryan about their future, and you can really see him start to question his decision to abandon Ryan and go to university. This entire scene has an air of bittersweet awkwardness to it that plays really well. Anyway, the chill ending with them playing with Kez at the end finishes the episode on a great note, and it sets up the existential nightmare of the next one pretty well. Overall, this episode is more of a low-key one despite the beginning, and it's pretty great. The only thing really holding this episode back is Kez's friends making fun of her, but that plotline never really goes anywhere, and honestly doesn't play into her eventual arc. Still, a great episode that deals with the repercussions of their actions while off the train. Episode 7, The Art Gallery Car. The boys' disintegrating relationship finally comes to a head when they end up in a haunted art museum with seemingly no exit. This episode starts with Ryan and Min just joking around. While I get that conflict is necessary for a story, I really appreciate the few moments of Kez, Ryan, and Min hanging out with no conflicts between them, especially like when in this episode, Kez's only role is to make jokes. The setting of this car and the one denizen who inhabits it, who we'll get to later, are also both fantastic. Eventually, Min-gi becomes cold towards Ryan, both literally and metaphorically. While the last episode may have you believe that joking about YMO is all that they needed, this episode makes the distinction that while it was the docent that turned them against each other, everything they said at least had a bit of truth. The docent's hands slowly taking over each character as they become crueler towards each other is fantastic. Kez is also great in this episode as comedic relief, and this is probably her best episode. Her failing to talk to Min and then screaming on the floor is honestly hilarious. It's a stark contrast to Ryan and Min's relationship deteriorating in the background. The idea that both characters are trying to avoid becoming completely like the other is honestly genius. While Ryan just having to see the entire picture was a bit forced, watching the docent slowly creep up on Min while Ryan watches helplessly is fantastic, visually and thematically. But the real highlight of the episode is what happens next. Ryan cries out that he won't leave Min, and then the train completely checks him. This scene is perfect, as the train knows that Ryan will consider leaving Min to die for a chance to go home. While the scene is set up for Ryan to reject leaving and save Min, he instead considers it, a paradox that meant that he really couldn't actually leave. Min eventually escapes from pure luck and correctly assumes that Ryan almost left him again, as the episode ends with no resolution. This episode is incredibly good. The atmosphere is one of the best of the show, the docent's design is incredibly creepy, and they utilize the train's abilities in fantastic thematic ways. Min and Ryan are great in this episode, and the docent causes them to say exactly how they feel, no matter how hurtful. Ryan's actions on the bridge especially were great, and the looks towards his hand, the door, and Min made for an intense scene. Overall, a fantastic episode that easily overcomes the occasional weird coincidence. Episode 8, The Mega Maze Car. As the duo nears Kez's home, they are forced to contend both with all of their enemies and their messy relationship. This episode is split into two parts, Min and Ryan talking, and the chase scene with everyone coming back to get Kez. The first half is really good. Having the characters go through a maze, one with Kez leaving them mostly to themselves, is the best environment for them to address what happened in the last car. Ryan and Min-gi have opposite problems of each other. Ryan goes too fast, has nobody who cares about him, and couldn't get Min to go with him. Min stays still, has his parents controlling him, and is afraid that Ryan will leave him behind again. This episode fully addresses this by having both characters come to terms with the fact that they are both at fault for what has come of their friendship. This entire section is written beautifully, with Kez being the comedic relief in between each section. Once the section ends, we get to the second half, which is much more. The villain of each car, except for the docent, arrives to chase Kez and her corpses. This chase scene is almost entirely action-based with a bit of comedy in there. The problem is that each of the characters are a bit too goofy to be serious. It's hard to get into an action scene with a French cow creamer, a pig toddler voiced by J.K. Simmons, and a group of parka-wearing humanoid raccoons that can shift through evolutionary states. Not much to say about this scene, as besides the cow creamer being turned into products and the pig toddler coming up like a whale to swallow the judge, the rest was a bit boring. The tease of Morgan's true identity leaves the episode with some suspense. Overall, while the latter half of this episode was a bit mediocre, the great writing in the first half to counter the last episode makes it a pretty good one. Episode 9, The Castle Car. Having finally arrived at Kez's home, Ryan and Min-gi learn of her biggest secret and regret. Having just come off 4 episodes in a row about trying to repair Mingy's and Ryan's relationship, an episode without them majorly featuring was a given. Having Kez have ulterior motives to bring the boys with her to Morgan was a neat plot point that I wish they spent more time on. The over the garden wall comparisons are very easy to make. Anyway, they seem more interested in seeing what she did to Jeremy instead. Speaking of Jeremy, his entire existence is very hit or miss this episode. Some parts of his and Morgan's story is fantastic, like her angrily throwing his clothes and food towards Min and Ryan. I also thought that them finally getting mad at Kez for her continuous carelessness was a very satisfying moment. Eventually, after a mostly useless reading of his journal, we get Ryan and Min confronting Kez. This scene is set up like Kez is about to reveal the worst thing that she ever did. The thing is, what she actually did with Jeremy was the right thing to do. His story was a nice addition to the episode, but the real importance is that the apparent worst thing that Kez ever did was help someone get through their problems. While this is kind of the point, it undermines the entire point of Kez's arc. Her whole arc is about needing to apologize, as shown in the next episode especially. Yet here she reveals that her biggest secret is something that she doesn't even need to apologize for. There's not much time to sit on that realization as we get the final part of the sneak peek into Amelia's takeover, which is unfortunately pretty short. It's pretty interesting, especially Morgan and Ryan's response to it. The entire episode has Ryan being upset at the train and Kez, and while it is a bit uncharacteristic, both Kez and the train do deserve it. This episode is a mixed bag. While the scene with Morgan throwing stuff at the boys is very good, the rest range from mediocre to frustrating. This episode is not terrible or great, just somewhere in the middle. Episode 10, The Train to Nowhere. Ryan and Mingy are forced to face the truth and a final challenge if they ever want to go home. This episode starts with Ryan still in crisis mode. I'm glad they have Ryan tell Mingy that he almost took his exit while Min was still in the art gallery car. They write his reaction pretty well, having him be shocked and upset while still understanding. Min and Ryan just jamming out in the middle of the night is fantastic calm before the storm, as they actually manage to tie in multiple plot points incredibly well during the climax. Up until this point, the Jeremy subplot and the Min and Ryan stuff had been kept separate. However, they use Min getting his exit as both an opportunity to prove that he won't leave Ryan, and as a straw that broke the castle's back for Morgan. Unfortunately, after this great scene of Morgan trying to force Min into his exit, the episode gets a bit corny. It turns out that the solution to all of Kez's problems was just to apologize. This sucks for more reasons than just being corny, though. One of them is that, as I already mentioned, she doesn't owe Morgan an apology for helping Jeremy. This directly contradicts last season's finale that had Grace telling Simon that she doesn't owe him an apology for helping someone else, which is exactly what Kez does here. Anyway, the group of people chasing after Kez just kind of leave after the apology, although I did enjoy Cow Kramer and Pig Baby during this scene. Anyway, Ryan gets his exit during the little apology time, and they say goodbye to Kez. This scene is great, and Ryan ringing Kez is a nice end to their time together, and Morgan wanting to talk later instead of being better with an immediate fix was also pretty good. The very last scene is also fantastic, both musically and animation-wise. It's not incredibly deep like the ending of the last 2 books, but it's extremely fun and is the happiest ending imaginable. I really tried to find a way to give this finale a perfect score, mainly because they really do handle the Min and Ryan stuff fantastically, but the apology spree scene is just too much to handle, and the end of Kez's arc is a disappointment. Alright, that's the final episode, so let's do the season overview. First off, let's talk about the animation for the book. While it's still pretty decent, it is a downhill from the first 3 books. Especially book 3 looked fantastic at times, but here, there are just some shots that look terrible. I get that the character designs are different because one was in control, but I found the more humanoid creatures to be less visually appealing. Anyway, with that kind of stuff out of the way, let's get into the actual plotline. First up is Amelia stuff, which is really cool, and in hindsight sucks that it's so limited. I'm sure that if they knew this was the last book, they would have highlighted it more, but in its current state, it's nothing more than a tease. Next up is Kez's plot, which is kind of okay at times. Okay, I'm gonna be real, this plot is massively disappointing. This is the first time the season has had this disconnected of a subplot, and it kind of just falls on its face. I get that it connects the episodes or whatever, but as I talked about pretty extensively in the last episode's review, the arc is very messy. Morgan and Jeremy's stuff is cool at first, but goes on for way too long. Kez herself is at her best with comedic relief, and is not very good at carrying dramatic scenes. Speaking of dramatic scenes, let's talk about the main musicians, Ryan and Mingy. These 2 characters are easily the best things about the book, and it's not even close. The first episode introduces them in a fantastic way and makes each character likable and seem in the right. Then, after things go a bit cold for a bit, the stretch of episodes between the end of the Astro Q car and the midpoint of the Mega Maze car have some of the best writing in the entire show. Each character has their own problems, and these problems mirror the others so well. This makes for two interesting characters and even more interesting relationship between the two. Their arc throughout the book definitely feels better on a rewatch, especially since the climax is strangely placed in episode 7. Besides the docent and the cat, most of the other characters exist for comedy, and these characters do make this one of the funniest books, and definitely the most consistently funny one. Pig Baby and Cow Creamer are especially funny, even more in the finale. While I get that some people, including myself to an extent, are kind of upset about the lighter tone of this season in comparison to the other ones, they did kind of need to write a more chill season after the tragedy that was book 3. When it comes to giving this book a score, it's very hard for me to decide what to give it. Obviously, I like the Ryan and Min stuff a lot, but the Kez stuff just wasn't very good, so I decided to give it the same score as books 1 and 2 at an 8 out of 10. While it's not as good as book 2, its latter half puts it around the quality of book 1. If this truly is the last season and attempts to get it renewed fail, then as a finale season, this book isn't terrible, but definitely could have been more cinematic. Speaking of which, I think I'm going to hold off on doing the series overview until it's been a bit longer with no news. Unfortunately, I even feel that if HBO Max were to renew it tomorrow, we wouldn't even hear about it until book 5 is done, which could take up to a year. Still, we should have a better idea about whether or not it's getting renewed or not pretty soon. Anyway, my least favorite episode was the iceberg car, my favorite episode was the art gallery car. Remember, if you're watching this today, there is currently a trend party on Twitter, so make sure you tweet out the phrase, finished Infinity Train. Anyway, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you for probably Gravity Falls next. Thanks for watching.